Well, good morning. It is a couple minutes past time to get started, so we'll go ahead and jump into this. Thankful to have everybody out this morning. We got some with us that were out, and we still got some out. Is Michael down, sick, kid sick? Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Well, good. Yep. Yep. And she's had a hard time. So, got Brother Roger back in here with us, and he's gonna. Okay. All right, as we get started, ask Brother Roger. He's back with us today. He's going to open us up with a word of prayer.
Our great God, Father, we bow to you. So thankful that you've given us life and breath this morning for this day and for the opportunity and the trust that you have granted us to meet with one another as brethren, engage in one of the loves that we have in order to study your word. We have come to see the great value that it is, the great love that you have for us and the gift that to us. We can know how to live in harmony with the purpose for which you made us. Be with Sam and be direct our study as well as all of the teachers and all that are engaged in study here this morning as others who have the word. May we be of one mind and one judgment. May we treasure the unity that we have and seek to build upon it and solidify it with godly living and with caring concern for each other. Let us always be prayerful for each other, for strength of faith and agreement, and for the things that we have studied thus far in the Epistle to James, knowing that we will face both trial and temptation. Let us be prepared for it and do all things with resolve to be faithful and come to you. Look to you for protection that only you can give us. Bless us in your efforts to spread the gospel local and abroad. Help us to be a good influence before others with whom we encounter. Help us to pursue peace with all men. And we ask this in Jesus' name.
Man, thank you. So Wednesday we left off. We finished up in verses 10 and 11, and we'll back up in, just to kind of catch up, in chapter 2, verse 9, we'll start reading here. James chapter 2 and verse 9 says, "For if you have respect to persons, you commit sin, and are convinced of the law as transgressors. For whosoever shall keep the whole law and yet offend in one point, he is guilty of all. For he that says, do not commit adultery, said also, do not kill. Now if thou commit no adultery, yet if you kill, you become a transgressor of the law." So we mentioned, some things we spoke about on Wednesday was how seemingly plain language this is in verse 9. Very plain language. Then you're guilty of sin. Verse 10 and 11, if you offend in one point, well, you're guilty of all. This is very similar to James chapter 1 and verse 26. About bridling your tongue, you deceive your heart. Anybody just seems to be religious, seems to be showing the importance of yielding that complete obedience, and to impress upon the mind a sense of the enormity of sin, from the fact that the violation of any one precept is offense against the whole law of God. One portion of the law is as binding and important as another, and we're accountable to all of it. And that's how significant sin is. We finished off talking about just the analogy that I come across. If you have a 20-foot long chain rope, and just one small link was broken, what's the condition of the chain? Well, it's broken. It doesn't matter which link it is. I mean, it takes it all to be complete. So that's kind of where we left off on Wednesday. In verse 12, he says, So speak and do as they that shall be judged by the law of liberty. So summing up, seems to be summing up the previous reasonings, previous verses. If you're going to speak, simply, if you're going to speak, do it as James chapter 1 and verse 19. Be swift to hear and slow to speak, slow to wrath. And also James 1:26 that we just read a moment ago. And then we'll get into more of what he has to say about speaking in chapter 3. But if you're going to speak, do it as it's been described already. And if you're going to speak, then do it. Let your words match your actions. Again, seems to be mirroring the thoughts displayed on the Sermon of the Mount in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 37. In Matthew chapter 5 and verse 37, Jesus says, Matthew chapter 5 and verse 37. But let your communication be yea, yea, or nay, nay. For whatsoever more of these cometh out of an evil heart. So if you're going to speak, whatever you're going to say, do it. Do it. He says, it goes on at the end of the verse, it says, but know that you're going to be judged by the law of liberty. And this is an interesting phrase. This law of liberty, it's mentioned twice in the Bible. At least in the King James, both here by James in chapter 1 and verse 25, and then chapter 2 and verse 12 that we just read. So this law of liberty, he's mentioned several laws, royal law of liberty. Here he's mentioned it again. So this would be, the gospel, right? This law of liberty, the gospel. I had come across a commentary thought here, this law of universal love, which alone is perfect freedom. This commentary thought says, in the preceding verse and this passage, we read the words law. Chapter 2, verse 8 through 12, the law of liberty in verse 12, the perfect law of liberty in 125, and the royal law, chapter 2 and verse 8. Vine's Dictionary of New Testament Words defines law, or Greek as nomos, at that which means the rule of standard. Law of liberty means freedom. When one obeys the gospel of Christ, the blood of Christ cleanses them. His blood washes away sin and sets the guilty free from sins committed against God. The word perfect, or Greek teleon, means full or completeness. The word royal, Greek basilikos, means belonging to a king. All of these laws are referring to the New Testament law of Christ or the law of the New Covenant. Other inspired writers speak of the Old Testament law as the law of bondage. We're reminded that being under the New Testament law of Christ not only frees us from the bondage of sin, but also from the handwriting of ordinances that was against us, which was contrary to us and took it out of the way, nailing it to the cross, according to Colossians chapter 2 and verse 14. So, you got any comments on what we're said, what's being said through verse 12, this law of liberty? Around what? That's right. That would be. You're bound. You're bound to that. You can't get rid of you. You can't do it yourself. So why? Yeah. Wow. Wow. Well, that adds a visual, to me at least, to this law of liberty. I mean, we do the best we can, but let Christ handle it. Let the blood of Jesus cleanse us from that.
But they think that he hasn't come yet, back already.
Yeah.
So see, that's,
Yeah.
I guess, there is no forgiveness, I guess, so they think he hasn't come yet.
To God's glory that we're not under the old law. Yeah. Great point. Great point. Anything else?
It's that freedom that allows us in mercy to rule in the law. You still love your neighbor as yourself.
Yeah.
If you're living down, it's inward. You're always thinking about your own sin and how you want to atone for that. But like Christ came and had a counterpart, means you have to love your neighbor, to spread the gospel, to spread joy.
Good point. Which leads right into verse 13. For he shall have judgment without mercy. He that shows no mercy, and mercy rejoices against judgment. So Greek, I don't know. I don't know Greek, and I'm making a huge list of all these Greek words. Maybe I'll remember some of them. I don't know. But Greek, eleos, it's the outward manifestation of pity. And it assumes, and I like this, it assumes need on the part of him who receives it, and resources adequate to meet the need on the part of him who shows it. And man, that's awesome. And who needs it? Well, we need it. We need the mercy of the one that's willing to give it, and that being God, and his resources are far adequate to take care of the mercy that we need. It seems to be that James is simply saying that any Christian who fails to show pity, he's not going to receive any mercy in the judgment. And showing pity or showing mercy, it's a Bible concept found throughout the Bible. We'll look at a few of these. Don't want to spend all the time on this, but in Proverbs chapter 3, somebody would read Proverbs chapter 3 and verse 3, and Proverbs 21 and verse 13.
Proverbs 3:3. Do not let kindness and truth leave you. Bind them around your neck, write them in the tablet of your heart.
I mean, if it's on your heart, that's a pretty significant spot to have it, right? 21 verse 13.
He who shuts his ear to the cry of the poor, also cries himself.
Yeah, man. 2 Samuel chapter 22. 2 Samuel chapter 22. Verse 26 and verse 27.
With the merciful you will show yourself merciful. With the blameless man you will show yourself blameless. With the cruel you will show yourself cruel.
Thank you. Micah chapter 6 and verse 8.
He hath showed you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God.
Wonderful. New Testament, Matthew chapter 6. Matthew chapter 6. Verse 14 to 15.
For if you forgive men their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive men their trespasses, neither will your Father forgive you.
Thank you. And we won't read this next one, but Matthew chapter 18, beginning in verse 23 through the end of the chapter, just the whole idea to forgive your brother. The servant that was indebted, and he was forgiven a small amount that he went after, and he choked and threw in prison somebody that owed him. He was shown mercy, but he did not show mercy, and in turn, the mercy that was given to him was taken away. So, and then Luke chapter 6 and verse 36.
Be merciful even as your Father is merciful.
And if we had nothing else, that one should do it right there, right? If we want to emulate God, here's a characteristic: be merciful. Possibly James had the same principle in mind as our Lord when he taught, when the Lord taught his disciples in Matthew chapter 5. It seems like James is pulling a lot of information from the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew chapter 5, down in verse 7. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Mercy, which would certainly would be mercy rejoicing against judgment, or the idea of mercy triumphing over judgment. A question for me and for us would be when we stand, or when I stand in judgment, will I be pleading for strict justice for myself, or will I, in my case, will I be pleading for mercy? I mean, what is it that we want from God, from Christ on judgment? In Ephesians chapter 2, we see, Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 4, we see, the words, God is rich in mercy. And we see how it prevails over justice. The mercy of God prevails over justice in the saving of sinful man. That we kind of started out there, that law of freedom, perfect law of freedom, the mercy and the grace of Jesus. So just a question, and you can refer back to Matthew chapter 6, 14 and 15 on this. I mean, what will judgment be like for one who is not willing to forgive others of their trespasses? Not willing to show that pity and to show that mercy that James speaks about. What can that individual expect in judgment if they're not willing to show mercy? They'll not receive it, right? Man, that's great. And even if it's a single offender or maybe a repeat offender, are we showing partiality on that? Well, you've messed me over many times. I'm done with the mercy. That's dangerous. It's dangerous ground. Anything else? Man, that's great. And that's chapter 1, verse 23. That idea that beholding yourself in that mirror. I mean, that whole concept, that principle just That should be the biblical concept. This is what God says. How am I doing? I mean, that's great. That's great. And I've been right there with you. I mean, for sure.
I think withholding that mercy, I feel like it's the same, like, it's hurting you so much more than the person you're withholding that mercy from. You, that person is already living in a certain way, and you can help them, but you withholding that mercy is actually affecting yourself so much more. And I think about that with forgiveness. Like, I think when it takes so much energy to continue to hold a grudge against someone, like I can feel it when I'm like if me and Zach have an argument and I'm still just holding something against him, it takes so much energy from me to hold that. And then once we finally resolve that and talk about it, forgive one another, it's amazing what it does, like actually for me and myself. And then to think of it in the context of how much you don't want God withholding that against you because you are holding it against someone else. I feel like it's powerful.
Oh, totally. I mean, that's real life stuff. So that's good. Good. Well, this next little section, this is. I'm sure there's been fistfights over the course of religious error for this next deal here. Verses 14 through 26. Let's just hammer it all out. Who wants to read all that? Let's just run through it. The reading anyway. Thank you.
What use is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone says he has faith, if he has no works? Can that faith save him? Brother or sister without clothing in need of daily food. One of you says to them, go in peace, be warmed and be filled, yet you do not give them what is necessary for the body. What use is that? In the same way, faith also, if it has no works, is dead, being by itself. But someone may well say, you have faith, and I have works. Show me your faith without the works, and I will show you my faith by my works. You believe that God is one. You do well. The demons also believe and shudder. But are you willing to acknowledge, you foolish person, that faith without works is useless? Was their father Abraham not justified by works when he offered up his son Isaac on the altar? You see that faith was working with his works, and as a result of works, faith was perfected. And the scripture was fulfilled which says, and Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness, and he was called a friend of God. You see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. In the same way was Rahab the prostitute not justified by works also, and she received the messengers and sent them out by another way. Just as the body without the spirit is dead, so also faith without works.
Thanks, sir. So just some, I guess, summarized thoughts. Seems like perhaps the whole reason for this context, this 14 through 26, at least in my mind, stems back to James chapter 1 and verse 22. James 1:22, but be ye doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving your own selves. I mean, this if you could do one or the other, which seems to be the obvious problem here, the reason James is bringing this up, deceiving them own selves. Now, I think that's the key. To do one without the other, that's a self-deception. And even James in chapter 1 and verse 27, he goes on, pure religion undefiled before God is what? James 1:27 is to do what? To do, right? I mean, just to take action, to do, right? To demonstrate your love. And in that particular example, it spoke about two different things: visit the fatherless and the widows in their affliction, but to do, to take action. I don't know. Were these Christians guilty of practicing a faith-only belief? I mean, there's a reason he's brought this up, and perhaps it seems as such. Some of the examples he brings up here in verse 15 and 16, but bless you. But in this context, James meets the case of those who seek to avoid practice by sheltering themselves under this pretense of faith. This first question he asks, is there profit? Now, verse 14 says, to say that you have faith and no works, in verse 14, as compared to what we see in verse 15 and 16, to see your brethren in need and just hope. Man, I just hope you can get something done about that, about your problem, but not be willing to do anything about it yourself. Is there a profit in that, to that individual and to yourself? Is there any profit in just hoping somebody gets something done, if you have the ability to do anything? Absolutely not. That's what he's saying. Absolutely not. Can the two really be separated? In John chapter 6, John chapter 6, I want to start reading verse 26. John chapter 6, 26 through 29. John chapter 6, verse 26. Jesus answered and said unto them, Verily, verily, I say unto you, you seek me, not because you saw the miracles, but because you did eat of the loaves and were filled. Labor not for the meat which perishes, but for that which, but for that meat which endures unto everlasting life, which the Son of Man shall give unto you, for him hath God the Father sealed. Verse 28. Then they said unto him, What shall we do that we might work the works of God? Verse 29. Jesus answered and said unto them, This is the work of God, that you believe on him who he had sent. So at least in this message, in this context, and nothing else in my mind, the way I understand this, Jesus answered and said, This is the work of God, that ye believe to him that is sent. The work and work and belief, they go together. If we want to do the work of God, we have to believe, and with that comes other things. James answers his own question. Is it profitable? In verse 17. He says, Even so faith, if it hath not works, it's dead. It's dead because it's alone. So I'll stop right there. So what can the class add to this?
I know you have some, I'm stepping on toes there, John. I know you have some thoughts too. I think the key to understanding this line of thinking that many still today seem to think it contradicts Paul's notion of faith and works. And he states very, I think it's important to look at Romans 3:28. I think that distinguishes the type of work that Paul's talking about, the types of work that James talking about. So if you read Romans 3:28, he makes a very specific, I think, reference to what types of works Paul's talking about. And he's talking about specifically works of the law. And Paul's emphasis was wanting to demonstrate that we're saved by grace through faith. Faith is a vitally important piece of it. But he wants to emphasize that we're not saved by works of the law. James seems to take that same concept, but wants to convey that faith without some demonstration of obedient faith. So he's talking about works of obedient faith. And citing John 6 is a key one because but over and over again here, he's going to be using examples citing not these individuals performing works of the law. And he makes a very clear distinction. When he talks about Abraham and Rahab, they weren't justified by performing works of Moses. In fact, Abraham lived when there wasn't the law of Moses. And Rahab specifically didn't live under the law of Moses. So you wonder why he used these two specific examples, because they didn't live under the law of Moses, but they were yet justified by their obedience.
Yeah, I think it's even similar. Romans 3:20 says very, very clearly, keepers of the law are not justified. And they won't be justified because the law highlights sin. But at the same time, when you go to Rahab, it was, she believed. I mean, she, with her own mouth, confesses, we know who this God is, and we know what you all are going to do. You're going to defeat us. And their instruction to her is works-based. Do these things. Bring everyone into your house. Place the scarlet rib out the window. Don't let anybody leave. All these things that you must do, or your blood's on your own head. So, bringing up Rahab in that section, it highlights some manifestation of your faith. And again, he's using examples, partiality, obviously treating others the way they should be treated, using all these things are manifestations of our faith. So he's saying that for your faith to really be meaningful, to be worth anything, there needs to be some manifestation of your faith through obedience. That's a key part. This flies in the face of Calvinism. And anybody who has any connection to Calvinism, which most Baptist churches do. But the idea that we're not saved by faith alone, you hear that in every lesson. You go on YouTube, you listen to these guys, they'll consistently use faith alone. You're saved by faith alone. And so the way they deal with this is they basically say James doesn't disagree that faith alone saves, even though he specifically says it. They say that his understanding of justify is different. So they parse this out somehow to make James say what he doesn't say by defining the word justify. So James' justification is different than Paul's justification. Well, that's not true at all. That's the reason why Martin Luther had a really hard time with this book. It's the reason why anybody who has any connection to Calvinism has a really hard time with this. I would say that more likely Paul's use of the word faith is different than James' use of the word faith here in verse 2. When Paul speaks of faith, he speaks of faith in its full capacity, that faith is more than just a belief. Faith is an action based on belief. It is action that is motivated and manifested because of belief. And James uses it here as strictly just a belief. Paul is using it in its full sense when he says you're justified by faith. James is using it in connection to these arguments that he raised up against it, that it doesn't matter what happens. And on top of that, John and Zach get all credit for my sermon today because they preached it for me.
Well, I guess we can stop. We can go out there and listen to you then. We're done.
It's going to go straight to the Lord's Supper.
Yeah. So, and I mean, that word, Greek word pistis, and that's where the top of my notes here will pick up, and about everything I have here has been talked about, so for the sake of time, we're going to keep talking about it. So, the conviction of the truth, right? Pistis, conviction of, how convicted? How deep is one's conviction? How deep is one's conviction if there are no actions to back up the claims? And I think that makes sense, right? How deep are one's convictions if there are no actions to back up the claims? And that idea of faith, I mean, is it just generalities, is believing in something? Well, we see that down here. The devils believe, but they don't have anything to back it up. They choose not to follow through with it. So, right.
And I know we're not down there yet, but it's interesting that the demons believe and they shudder, and yet the demons
everything just like you said. It's sobering. But I do think it's important to note that the writer of Hebrews and the writer of James want to emphasize, you see this really shift in emphasis on the old law. Because the Jews that had become Christians, some who were in this assembly, were still feeling as though they were justified by the law. They felt as though that there was, if I just go to these, if I do these customs, if I follow these customs, like Tim was talking about, people who live their life following a cycle of custom after custom after custom, that somehow that justifies them. And James here, and as well as the writer of Hebrews, seems to just keep emphasizing that those the works of the Mosaic law. And that's why he refers to Jesus as Melchizedek. Melchizedek, of course, did not live under the law. And neither did these individuals, Abraham and Rahab, did not live under the old law. So, that's
I wonder if even this, not necessarily being connected to partiality, but the Jewish mindset was if you're rich, you're right. You've done good things, you've been blessed, and so I can see how someone can become this concept that I am a wealthy and I'm healthy and I don't have any problems, and so I must be saved because I have faith that came from God, and that would fly in the face of Jesus was none of those things. He wasn't wealthy. He wasn't. He was beaten and scorned by everyone that he was saved. So
that's why the Sadducees had a real hard time with it.
yeah.
The Sadducees were exactly who you're talking about. They were the wealthy. They were the ones who lived and felt as though that they were justified by that. But that concept really exists in the mindset of Jews today. Even secular Jews. I mean, they're known for, you don't see very many Jews begging on the roadside. I mean, they're generally very well-to-do just because of that. There's this drive to be successful, and that somehow gives them a sense that they're right and that they're in the right place in the world.
Anything else?
I didn't mean that to sound anti-Semitic at all, so please don't take that.
And as has been mentioned, we'll get through some of this. It's been mentioned already. That this passage does appear to be opposed to Paul's teachings, and a lot of this stuff has been mentioned. In one area, Paul says in Romans chapter 3 and verse 28 has already been mentioned. We conclude that a man is justified by faith apart from works of the law. In James 20, verse 26, that faith without works is dead, and that a man is justified by works and not by faith only in verse 24. Second point would be Paul speaks of Abraham as being justified by faith in Romans chapter 4 and Galatians 3 and 6. And James said he was justified by works. So this tag on justified by faith and justified by works. And then the third point would be the Hebrew writer has been mentioned, appeals to the case of Rahab as an instance of faith. Hebrews 11 verse 31. James refers to her as an example of justification by works in verse 25. To me, and it's been stated already, but it seems the biggest difference in their teaching was the approach. Paul's standpoint was the negation of the law. Romans chapter 6 and verse 14 says, you are not under the law, but under grace. With James, it's the perfection of law. The gospel in James's eyes is a law, but not a mere system of rules such as touch not, taste not, handle not type thing. It's not a regard as the it's no hard bondage. Excuse me. It's not a hard bondage as the old law was, for it's a law of liberty, which is the exact accordance with the teachings of Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 17, where we read that where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. So Paul goes on to say in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, though I have all faith, but I don't have love, I don't have charity, what is he? Nothing. If you don't have love, you're nothing. So, at least in my mind, to help Sam make it sense, it's having the faith that causes and develops that deep love that moves us to action, which in turn expresses the faith that we claim to have. And that's what I think James is saying. If you have the faith, in time you're going to develop that love and that concern for your brethren and for whomever, that's going to move us to action. And it's that action, that expression of our faith that we're claiming to have. So, for these brethren, and for us today, and any Christian who fails to maintain a working faith, I think it's fair to say that you cannot expect the continual cleansing from sin that we see in 1 John chapter 1 and verse 7. In 1 John chapter 1 and verse 7 it says, if we walk in the light, as He is in the light, we have fellowship one with another, and the blood of Jesus Christ the Son cleanses us from all sin. So if we're not in that walk with Him, we don't have the cleansing from sin. Zach mentioned also where Paul speaks in Ephesians chapter 2, context is in 8 through 10, but in verse 10 it says, for we are His workmanship, created in Christ Jesus unto good works, which God hath therefore ordained that we should walk in them. So if we're saved by grace through faith, and it's not because of any works that we could do of ourselves, but that we do what? That we walk. We're told to walk, but we walk in what? According to Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 10, we're to walk in what? Good works, right? It's His workmanship. Why? Because by faith we do those things because we trust God's power and love to be demonstrated through our actions. God's power and God's love will be demonstrated through our actions. And that's why we do what we do, because He's told us to do it. And as we finish up here, just 2 minutes, John chapter 15 and verse 8. John chapter 15 and verse 8. It says, Herein is my Father glorified, that ye bear much fruit. So shall you be my disciples. How can I say that I have faith and not have works? By that verse, where's my fruit? Or Titus chapter 2. Titus chapter 2, down in verse 14. Who gave Himself for us, that He might redeem us from all iniquity and purify unto Himself a peculiar people, zealous of good works. How can I say that I have faith and not be zealous for good works? They don't match. They don't match. Really appreciate you all's comments today. Good to see everybody. We'll see you on Wednesday, and we'll pick back up here. I don't know where we're at. Around verse 15 or 16, I think.